The silence of a house at 2 a.m. isn't actually silent. If you sit still enough, you start to hear the bones of the building, the rhythmic ticking of the heater, the floorboards settling, and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I was sitting in bed, the blue light on my laptop screen the only thing keeping the shadows at bay. My room is on the ground floor, and my bed is positioned right against the far wall, parallel to a large sliding glass window that looks out into the narrow strip of yard between my house and the neighbor's fence. I glanced at the bottom corner of my screen. 2:13 a.m. That was when I heard it. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a soft, wet sound, like a boot pulling out of thick mud. Schlick. I froze. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I told myself it was just a stray cat, or maybe a heavy branch falling into the mulch. But then came the second sound, a metallic tink. It was the distinct sound of something brushing against the aluminum screen in my window. I didn't turn my head. I couldn't. My heart started to thud against my ribs, a heavy, slow beat that felt like it was echoing in my ears. Very slowly, I reached out and dimmed my laptop brightness until the screen went black. The room plunged into a thick, suffocating darkness. My eyes took a few seconds to adjust. The moonlight was weak, filtered through the overgrown oak tree outside, casting jagged, skeletal shadows across my carpet. I turned my head toward the window. At first, I saw nothing but the reflection of my own pale face in the glass, but as my vision cleared, I realized there was a shape blocking the moonlight. A silhouette was standing less than 2 feet away from me on the other side of the glass. It was a man. He was tall, impossibly thin, and he was standing perfectly still. He wasn't wearing a mask. He didn't have a weapon in his hand. He was just looking. His forehead was pressed directly against the glass, and his hands were cupped around his eyes to see past the reflection. I stopped breathing. I felt that cold, prickly sensation crawl up the back of my neck. I waited for him to move, to tap on the glass, to try the lock, but he did nothing. He just stared into the darkness of my room, searching for me. My phone was on the nightstand, just out of reach. To get it, I'd have to shift my weight, and the springs in my old mattress would definitely groan. I stayed paralyzed, watching the outline of his breath fogging up a tiny circle on the pane. Minutes passed. They felt like hours. I watched the fog on the glass grow and then shrink, grow and then shrink. Then he did something that made my stomach drop. He began to lean his weight forward, very slowly, until the glass began to creak under the pressure. He wasn't trying to break in. He was trying to get his face as close to mine as physically possible through the barrier. I finally found my voice, though it came out as a pathetic, shaky whisper. "I can see you. I'm calling the police." The man didn't flinch. He didn't run. Instead, he tilted his head to the side, like a curious dog. Then, very slowly, he took one hand away from his face and began to slide it down the glass. His fingernails made a horrific, high-pitched screech against the surface. I lunged for my phone, knocking a glass of water off the nightstand. It shattered on the floor, the sound exploding in the quiet room. I scrambled to the other side of the bed, my hands shaking so hard I could barely swipe the screen to call 911. As the line began to ring, I looked back at the window. He was gone. The yard was empty. The shadows of the oak tree swayed gently in the breeze, and the neighbor's fence stood tall and silent. I stayed on the phone with the operator, my voice cracking as I gave my address. I didn't take my eyes off that glass for a single second. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, they walked the perimeter of the house with heavy flashlights. I stood in my doorway, wrapped in a blanket, watching the beams of light cut through the dark. The officer, a gruff man named Miller, walked over to me, looking puzzled. "We didn't find anyone," he said, clicking off his light. "But you were right to call. There are some fresh footprints in the flower bed right outside your window." "Did he go over the fence?" I asked, my voice trembling. Officer Miller rubbed the back of his neck. That's the thing. The footprints lead right up to your window. They're deep, like he was standing there for a long time. And then? I asked, my voice trembling. And then they just stop, Miller said, looking back toward the yard. There are no tracks leading away, no scuff marks on the fence. It's like he stood there looking at you, and then he just vanished into thin air. The police eventually left, telling me to keep my doors locked. It's now 4:45 a.m. The sun won't be up for a while. I'm sitting in my living room now, the lights turned on in every single room of the house. I thought I was safe, but I just walked past a hallway mirror and I noticed something. There, on the inside of my hallway window, the one that leads to the enclosed porch, is a small, faint circle of fog, and right in the center of it is the clear, oily smudge of a forehead and 2 handprints. He isn't outside anymore.
The oaks surrounding my house don't sway, they loom. In the daylight, the suburbs of Oak Haven are a postcard of domestic peace, but at night, when the street lamps struggle to pierce the dense canopy of interlocking branches, the world shrinks to the size of my bedroom. It started on a Tuesday, exactly at 2:14 a.m. I was drifting in that shallow ocean between wakefulness and sleep when a sound pulled me to the surface. It wasn't the rhythmic thumping of a branch or the light skittering of a squirrel. It was heavy. It was deliberate. Thump. Pause. Thump. The sound of a bipedal weight pressing into the shingles directly above my head. Someone was walking on my roof. The first ascent. I sat up, my breath hitching in my throat. The house was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I stared at the ceiling, my eyes tracing the faint cracks in the plaster. Then a new sound, a slow, rhythmic dragging. It sounded like a heavy sack being pulled across the grit of the asphalt shingles. Scrape, scrape. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I told myself it was a raccoon, a very large, very heavy raccoon. I grabbed a flashlight from my nightstand and crept to the window. Pushing aside the heavy curtains, I peered out into the darkness. The trees were black silhouettes against a charcoal sky. I leaned out, angling the beam upward toward the gutter line. The light cut through the mist, illuminating nothing but wet moss and a few stray leaves. The moment the light hit the roof, the noise stopped. I stayed there for an hour, shivering in the drafty air, but the silence remained absolute. I eventually fell into a fitful sleep, convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. The midnight vigil. The second night was worse. The footsteps didn't wait for 2 a.m. At 11:30 p.m., while I was brushing my teeth, I heard the distinct creak-crack of the rafters groaning under a sudden burden. It started at the far end of the house, over the garage, and moved with terrifying purpose toward the master bedroom. I didn't turn on the lights. I moved through the hallway in total darkness, my bare feet silent on the hardwood. I felt my way to the attic scuttle, a small wooden square in the ceiling of the hallway closet. I stood on a chair, my hand trembling as I pressed against the wooden panel. I expected to feel the vibration of movement, or perhaps hear breathing. Instead, I heard a sound that made my skin crawl, a soft, wet clicking, like a tongue hitting the roof of a mouth. Click, click, click. I shoved the panel up and shone my light into the attic. Dust motes danced in the beam. The insulation lay undisturbed, a gray sea of fiberglass. There was no one there, but as I lowered the panel, a long, thin shadow flickered across the shingles of the dormer window, visible through the attic vents. It looked like an arm, but it was far too long, with joints that bent at impossible, jagged angles. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the living room, clutching a kitchen knife, watching the shadows of the trees dance on the walls. Every time the wind blew, I saw fingers in the branches. The investigation. By the fourth night, the lack of sleep had turned the world into a blurred, monochromatic nightmare. The visitor had become bolder. The walk-in had turned into pacing, back and forth, back and forth. I decided to go outside. I stepped onto the back porch, the air cold and smelling of damp earth. I walked into the middle of the yard and turned back to look at the house. The roof was a steep, dark peak. I scanned the ridgeline. Nothing. Then I saw them. Near the chimney, 4 deep indentations were pressed into the shingles. Not the marks of shoes, but something sharper. They looked like the punctures of giant talons. And there, dangling from the edge of the gutter, was a strip of something white. I dragged a ladder from the shed, my movements fueled by a desperate, frantic need to know. I climbed, the metal rungs groaning under my weight. When I reached the gutter, I reached out and grabbed the white object. It was a scrap of fabric, a piece of a nightshirt, my nightshirt, the one that I had thrown in the trash 2 days ago because it had a mysterious tear in the shoulder. A cold dread washed over me. I looked up at the peak of the roof. There, crouched behind the brick chimney, was a shadow that didn't belong. It was darker than the night, a void in the shape of a man, but its limbs were coiled like springs. It wasn't looking at me, it was looking down, its head tilted at a 90-degree angle, staring into the skylight of my bathroom. I scrambled down the ladder fast I nearly fell, my boots skidding on the damp grass. I ran inside and locked every door and pushed the heavy dresser in front of the bedroom door. The final descent. Tonight is the 7th night. The house feels different. The air is thick, tasting of old copper and wet fur. The scratching didn't start on the roof tonight. It started on the walls. I'm sitting in the center of my bed, the only lamp in the room flickering. The sound is unmistakable now. It's the sound of something heavy dragging itself upward from the eaves. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It's not on the roof anymore. It's on the siding, just inches from my head, separated only by a layer of brick and drywall. I can hear it breathing, a wet, rattling sound that vibrates through the wall. Suddenly, the pacing on the roof begins again, but this time it's faster. It's running. The thuds are rhythmic, a frantic gallop circling the perimeter of the ceiling. Thump, 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 thump. Then, silence. The most terrifying silence I've ever experienced. I look up. The ceiling fan is swaying gently, though there is no breeze. And then I see it. A small, dark droplet falls from the edge of the attic scuttle in the hallway. Then another. I realize with a jolt of pure, icy terror why I never found anything on the roof when I looked. The scratching, the footsteps, the clicking, it was never just on the roof. I hear a soft thud from inside the hallway closet. The attic panel hasn't been pushed up. It's been slid aside from the inside. The floorboards in the hallway creak. 1 step, 2 steps. The weight is immense. The shadow stretching under my bedroom door isn't the shadow of a man. It's long, multi-jointed, and reaching for the handle. As the knob begins to turn, I realize the truth. Whatever was walking on my roof wasn't trying to get in. It was trying to get out.
In the sprawling, silent expanse of the Megacorp distribution warehouse, night shifts were defined not by activity, but by the oppressive weight of the absence of it. For Arthur, the lone security guard, the building at night felt like a behemoth in stasis, its metal lungs dormant until sunrise. He liked it that way. Arthur was a large man, built like the concrete pillars he patrolled, but he carried his bulk softly. He preferred the predictability of the shadows. Tonight, his station was the central security room, a dimly lit bunker insulated from the outside world by steel doors and soundproofed walls. A massive array of 32 CCTV monitors dominated one wall, a mosaic of static, shadows, and the flickering reflections of his own face. The first 6 hours were a script of standard protocol. Check cameras 1 through 10, loading docks A through D, all locked. Scan 11 through 20, racks F through H, shelves stacked high with wrapped pallets, a forest of consumer goods. Watch 21 through 32, administrative offices, the loneliest corridor in the world after 11 p.m. The shift began to fracture at 2:03 a.m. Arthur was idly flipping through the feeds on the main controller joystick, a routine action that felt less like vigilance and more like meditation, when he saw it. Camera 7, loading dock C. The massive, motorized, steel-shuttered door was partially raised. About 2 feet of dark night sky and rain-slicked concrete were visible at the bottom. Arthur's thumb froze on the stick. "Impossible," he muttered. He knew he had personally confirmed that door was sealed and deadbolted on his 1 a.m. walking round. He had felt the heavy clack of the mechanism. He didn't run. He called in. "Security station. Confirming status on camera 7. Loading dock C. Door is showing as partially open. Sending dispatch to investigate." There was no dispatch. He was the dispatch. He just liked the sound of the protocol. Arthur took his flashlight and heavy ring of keys, leaving the relative safety of the monitors. The warehouse air was cool, smelling of industrial dust and cardboard. The sound of his own heavy footsteps echoed down the long concrete canyon between the high-stacked racks. As he neared Dock C, his flashlight cut a neat circle in the dark. He prepared to feel the cool, wet wind of the open door. He reached the dock. The massive shutter was sealed, locked tight. The deadbolt was in place, not a centimeter of gap. He pulled his master key and turned it. It was secure. Confused, but chalking it up to a simple glitch in the matrix of his own exhaustion, Arthur returned to the control room. He checked the monitor for camera 7 again. The screen still showed the door wide open. His reflection was on the screen, staring intently at the image of the open door. The hair on his arm stood straight up. He was sitting in the room, but the camera, in real time, was showing a paradox. He forced himself to calm down. Digital cameras fail, he reasoned. The stream had probably looped. He restarted the entire monitoring console. The feeds blinked black, then initialized. Camera 7, loading dock C, door closed. Arthur sighed, a wet sound in the small room. But then, at 2:48 a.m., the anomaly shifted focus. Camera 14, rack G, the heart of the warehouse. The lights in that section, motion-activated and usually instant, flickered. Not a momentary dip, but a strobe effect. Long bursts of bright white, followed by an equally long burst of pure black, creating a visual staccato. In the brief flashes of light, a figure was visible. It was small, maybe 5 feet tall, and its outline was wrong. Not human wrong, just off-kilter. When the flash hit, it didn't appear to be walking. It was simply there, 20 yards closer to the camera. Flash, further down the aisle. Flash, directly under the lens, its face, if it had one, obscured by shadows cast by its own odd shape. Arthur pressed his face close to the monitor. In one flash, the distortion on the screen warped. The shape looked less like a figure and more like a tear in the footage itself, a localized blur of static and data corruption. But as it moved, the surrounding environment, the stacks of boxes, the steel beams, remained perfectly clear. The anomaly was traveling. "This is not a loop," he whispered. The figure reached camera 14, and the monitor feed turned to static, the red offline icon blinking with an accusing beat. The tension in the control room was now a physical presence wrapping around Arthur's neck. He didn't want to go out there again. He looked at the bank of monitors, searching for where the shape might re-emerge. Minutes bled into each other. He scanned camera 15, next aisle over, 16, 17, nothing. And then camera 22, the administrative corridor. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. On camera 22, he saw himself. The angle was wide. At the far end of the hallway, a man in the familiar Megacorp security uniform was standing still, looking up at the camera. The man was him. The posture, the slight slouch, the reflective patch on the jacket, it was unmistakable. But Arthur knew he was in the control room. He lifted his right hand. The figure on the monitor also lifted his right hand. He pointed a finger. The figure pointed back. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. He was a practical man, but this was a reality that had ceased to hold its own center. "Who are you?" he said to the screen, his voice thin. The figure on the monitor lowered his hand. It didn't look like an echo anymore. It looked like it was waiting. The anomaly, whatever it was, had moved from loading dock C into the aisles and now was occupying a simulation of him in the office complex, and it was getting closer to the control room. At 3:15 a.m., the lights in the corridor just outside the control room door began to flicker. A high-pitched whine, like a feedback from an old television set, started filling the room, emanating not from the speakers, but from the air itself. The monitors all went to static, every single one, except for two. The central large screen, still showing the administrative corridor, showed the fake Arthur turning a corner. He was walking toward the camera now, and his walk was not right. It was a jointless glide, a shuffle of pixels rather than a human stride. The other working monitor was camera 32. It was pointed at the door of the security control room itself. On that screen, Arthur watched as the door to his room, the heavy, locked, secure door, slowly, soundlessly began to open. There was no sound in the hallway outside camera 32, which he was viewing on the adjacent screen, but on camera 32's video, the door was moving. The feedback hum grew deafening, vibrating in his teeth. He looked at the large monitor. The distortion man, his double, was now 30 feet away from the corridor camera. He looked back to the small monitor. The door was fully open. Beyond it, on the screen, lay a swirling vortex of static and darkness, a maw deeper and blacker than any shadow in the building. Arthur felt the gravity in the room shift. The space behind his chair, the space that should have been the wall of the bunker, now felt thin, empty. He reached for the mouse, his hand trembling, trying to hit the record and bookmark button for this footage, a desperate act to provide evidence, to make sense of it later. His cursor hovered over the timestamp, 3:17:01. On the main monitor, the distorted figure was now so close, its pixelated, featureless face filled the screen. On the smaller monitor, a black, malformed arm made of the same corrupted data static reached from the vortex behind the control room door and wrapped around Arthur's chair from behind. He tried to scream, but the high-pitched feedback drowned it out. The vortex pulled. The next morning, the day shift supervisor, a man named Henderson, arrived to find the complex perfectly secure. Every door was locked, every alarm was set. In the control room, the primary console was online, all 32 CCTV screens displaying perfect, empty video of the warehouse. The supervisor went to check Arthur's log, assuming he'd just walked off the job and left it unlocked. The final timestamp entry in the digital log was at 3:17 a.m. The activity summary field contained only one word, typed repeatedly until it hit the character limit. Here, 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 here. Henderson, confused and angry, navigated to the playback archive for camera 32, the control room door. He wanted to see what time Arthur left. He scrolled to 3:17. The footage was clear. At 3:17:01, Arthur is sitting in his chair, typing in the log. At 3:17:02, he pauses. He lifts his hand to adjust his collar. Then, he simply is not there. There was no flash of light, No door opens, no figures emerge from the shadows. In the blink of an eye, within a single frame, Arthur's chair is empty. It doesn't even rock from the motion of him leaving it. The empty room remains still, the only movement being the soft green and blue lights of the rack servers reflecting in the quiet monitors. The timestamp continues to tick forward, 3:17:02, 3:17:03, documenting a room that would never again see its night guard.
The Blackwood Preserve was a place of heavy silences and ancient, suffocating density. At midnight, the canopy above was so thick it didn't just block the moon, it seemed to swallow the very idea of light. Elias checked his watch, the phosphorus hands glowing a sickly green. 12:04 a.m. He was 3 miles from his base camp, a distance he had covered a dozen times in daylight, but the darkness had transformed the topography. The smell of damp earth and rotting cedar was cloying, sticking to the back of his throat like wet wool. Every breath he took felt heavy, as if the forest were exhaling into him. He adjusted the strap of his pack, the nylon rasping against his jacket, a sound that felt deafeningly loud in the stillness. Then it happened. Elias. The sound wasn't a shout. It wasn't even a full breath. It was a sandpaper rasp, a vocalization that sounded like dry leaves skittering across a gravestone. He froze, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He swung his flashlight toward a cluster of gnarled oaks, the beam cutting a violent path through the gloom. Nothing but the silver bark of trees and the tangled skeletal fingers of low-hanging branches. "Hello?" he called out. His voice sounded thin, robbed of its authority by the sheer scale of the woods. No one answered. A distant owl shrieked, a jagged, lonely sound, and then the silence rushed back in, even heavier than before. Elias wiped sweat from his forehead, despite the biting chill. He told himself it was the wind moving through a hollow trunk, or perhaps a trick of his own exhausted mind. He kept walking, his boots crunching over the frost-dusted mulch. 5 minutes passed, 10. He began to pick up the pace, his lungs burning with the cold air. Elias, wait. This time it was closer. It came from the thicket to his left, just beyond the reach of his light. It didn't sound like a person. It sounded like a copy of a person. The vowels were too long, the S at the end of his name lingering like the hiss of a dying fire. He swung the light again. For a fraction of a second, the beam caught something, a tall, pale verticality that wasn't a tree trunk. It was too thin, too white, and it ducked behind a massive pine with a fluid, jointless grace that made Elias's stomach turn. "I have a knife," he lied, his voice cracking. "I'm not alone out here." The forest seemed to mock him. A rhythmic tapping began, the sound of wood hitting wood. Tap, 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 tap. It echoed from the north, then was answered by a similar knocking from the south. He was being flanked. The unraveling. Panic, shark and cold, finally took hold. Elias broke into a jog. The beam of his flashlight danced wildly, illuminating flashes of the nightmare around him. A pile of bleached deer bones arranged in a perfect circle, a knot in a tree that looked too much like a weeping eye. And the shadows, oh, the shadows. They didn't behave. When he ran past a tree, its shadow didn't follow the angle of his light. It stayed pinned to the trunk, peeling itself away like a scab, reaching out towards his heels. "Elias, why are you running?" The voice was right behind his ear. He spun around, swinging his heavy flashlight like a club, but he struck only the freezing air.
The smell of the forest changed instantly. The damp earth was gone, replaced by the copper tang of old blood and the sickly sweet scent of lilies. He stumbled over a protruding root and went down hard. His flashlight flew from his hand, tumbling across the forest floor before wedging itself between two rocks. The beam pointed straight up, creating a pillar of light that illuminated the swirling mist above. In that pillar of light, he saw them. They were perched in the branches of the hemlocks, dozens of them. They were spindly, gray-skinned things with limbs far too long for their bodies. They had no faces, just smooth, taut skin where eyes and noses should be. But they all had wide, jagged slits for mouths. One of them leaned down, its neck extending like a telescope. It opened its mouth, and Elias heard his mother's voice come out of it. "Elias, honey, come home." Another one, higher up, mimicked the sound of his own heavy breathing from 5 minutes ago. Another barked like a dog he had owned as a child. They weren't just following him, they were collecting him. They were harvesting his sounds, his history, his very identity. The final echo. Elias scrambled towards his flashlight, his fingers clawing at the dirt. He grabbed the cold metal casing and scrambled backwards until his spine hit the trunk of an ancient lightning-scarred elm. He shone the light upwards, but the branches were empty. The creatures had vanished, as if they had never been more than a hallucination. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no owls, not even the sound of his own pulse in his ears. "Please," he whispered, tears blurring his vision. "Just let me get to the road. Just let me get to the road." A dozen voices whispered back in perfect, mocking unison from every direction. He began to walk again, but he was no longer choosing his direction. The trees seemed to shift when he wasn't looking, closing off paths and opening others, funneling him towards the heart of the preserve, where the trees grew so close together they looked like bars of a cage. He reached a small clearing he didn't recognize. In the center stood a single rusted iron stake driven into the ground. Hanging from it was a tattered piece of nylon. Elias approached it, his breath hitching. He recognized the fabric. It was a scrap from his own blue rain jacket, the one he was wearing right now. He looked down at his arm. His jacket was intact. He reached out to touch the scrap, but stopped. Beneath the stake, scratched in the dirt in his own handwriting, were the words, "Say it back." A hand, cold as a glacier and thin as a twig, settled gently on his shoulder. Elias didn't scream. He couldn't. His throat felt like it had been filled with dry sand. He slowly turned his head. Standing behind him was a figure wearing his clothes, possessing his face, and holding his flashlight. The double looked at him with eyes that were nothing more than empty, bottomless pits. The double leaned in, its mouth unhinging to reveal a row of needle-like teeth, and whispered in a voice that was more Elias than Elias himself. "Elias, I heard my name in the forest at midnight." The real Elias tried to speak, to reclaim his name, but no sound came out. He felt his edges softening, his memories leaking out of him like water from a cracked jar. He looked down at his hands and saw them turning gray, his fingers stretching, his skin smoothing over. By the time the sun rose, there was only one Elias walking out of the woods towards the trailhead. He smiled at a passing hiker, but his smile was a fraction too wide, and his eyes didn't quite catch the light. Deep in the heart of the Blackwood Preserve, a new shadow sat in the high branches, waiting for the sun to go down so it could practice its new voice.
The humidity of the city had curdled into a thick, damp fog by the time the clock on my phone flickered to 1:04 a.m. I was standing at a skeletal bus stop on the edge of the industrial district, a place where the streetlights didn't so much illuminate the road as they did highlight the swirling grime in the air. My car was 5 miles back with a shredded fan belt and a dead battery. According to the digital schedule, the last bus had passed 3 hours ago. I was resigned to a long, shivering walk when the sound began. It wasn't the roar of a modern engine, but a deep, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to vibrate in my marrow before it reached my ears. Out of the soup of gray mist, 2 dim amber orbs appeared. A bus, ancient, boxy, and painted a shade of blue so dark it looked like bruised skin, rumbled to the curb. The doors hissed open with a sound like a dying gasp. I didn't question my luck. I was cold, exhausted, and the silence of the industrial park had begun to feel predatory. I climbed the steps, the rubber treading worn smooth by decades of invisible feet. "To the transit center?" I asked, reaching for my wallet. There was no answer. The driver's seat was high-backed and shrouded in shadow. I could see the edge of a dark cap and a heavy coat, but the figure remained perfectly still, hands gripped at 10 and 2 on a steering wheel that looked too large for the cabin. A dim, flickering fluorescent light ran the length of the ceiling, casting a jaundiced hue over the rows of empty vinyl seats. I tapped my card against the reader. It didn't beep. I tried again. Nothing. "Is the machine down?" I muttered. The driver didn't move. The door slammed shut behind me with a violent mechanical thud, and the bus lurched forward. I stumbled, grabbing a silver handrail. It was unnaturally cold, like a pipe pulled from a freezer. I took a seat halfway down the aisle, the vinyl cracking under my weight with a sound like breaking bone. The silence of the interior. For the first few minutes, I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid, but the atmosphere inside the bus was wrong. The air was heavy and smelled of wet wool and ozone. Despite the engine's thunderous vibration, the interior was vacuum-sealed in a terrifying silence. I couldn't hear the tires on the pavement or the wind against the glass. I could only hear my own breathing, which felt far too loud. I looked at my reflection in the window. Because of the internal lights in the pitch-black world outside, the glass acted as a mirror. I saw myself, pale and wide-eyed, but as I watched, the reflection of the seat behind me seemed to dip, as if someone had just sat down. I whipped my head around. The seat was empty. The cracked vinyl was undisturbed. I turned back to the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. In the glass, I saw it again. A faint gray smudge of a face, featureless save for 2 dark hollows where eyes should be, was staring at me from the road directly behind mine. I didn't scream. My throat had tightened into a hard knot. I stood up, my knees shaking, and moved 3 rows forward. I kept my eyes fixed on the back of the driver's head. "Hey," I called out, my voice cracking. "Can you let me off at the next light? I think I'll just walk." The driver didn't respond. We weren't stopping at lights anymore. In fact, we weren't even on the main road. The bus was hurtling through a landscape I didn't recognize, stretches of blackened trees and rusted fences that seemed to repeat in a sickening loop. The escalation. The flickering overhead lights began to hum, a low-pitched electrical moan that rose in volume until it vibrated in my teeth. Flicker. In the brief moment of darkness, I heard the sound of a zipper being undone. Flicker. A soft, wet cough from the very back of the bus. Flicker. Every time the lights went out, I felt the air grow colder. I felt the unmistakable sensation of a crowd. The bus was empty to my eyes, but the weight of the vehicle was changing. It leaned as if dozens of passengers were boarding at invisible stops. The suspension groaned. I felt a brush of fabric against my shoulder, a cold gust of air as if someone had rushed past me in the aisle. "Stop the bus!" I screamed, lunging for the stop request cord. I pulled it, and instead of a bell, a recording played over the cracked speakers.
It wasn't a voice announcing a street name. It was a chorus of whispers, hundreds of them, overlapping in a frantic, desperate garble. "Not my turn. Please, it's so cold. Is this the way home? Look at me! Look at me!" I scrambled toward the front, intent on grabbing the driver, but I froze. From my new vantage point, I could see the driver's mirror. It reflected the interior of the bus. In the mirror, the bus wasn't empty. Every single seat was occupied. Men in tattered suits, women with hair matted by river water, children with skin the color of ash, all of them were sitting perfectly straight, staring at the back of my head. And then, in unison, the reflections stood up. I turned around, gasping for air, but the aisle was physically empty. I was alone in a haunted shell. Yet I could hear the floorboards groaning under the weight of approaching feet. I could see the hand straps swaying as invisible hands gripped them. The bus began to slow. We were approaching a bridge, a massive concrete span that seemed to lead into a void of white fog. I lunged for the doors, clawing at the rubber seal. "Let me out! Let me out!" The bus came to a rhythmic, pulsing halt in the center of the bridge. The engine died, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. The driver finally moved. The head tilted slowly, far too far, a full 90 degrees to the side. A hand, skeletal and wrapped in ancient yellowed bandages, reached for the lever to open the door. The doors hissed open. I didn't jump out. I couldn't. Standing on the bridge, lined up in a neat, silent queue reaching into the mist, were hundreds of people. They were all dressed in the fashions of different decades, some in Victorian coats, others in 70s denim, all of them dripping wet and shivering. The first person in line, a young man with a jagged hole where his chest should be, stepped onto the bus. He walked right through me. A jolt of absolute soul-searing cold paralyzed my limbs. He took a seat in the middle of the bus, and as he sat, he became visible to my naked eyes, a pale, shimmering ghost. One by one, they began to board. They weren't looking for a ride. They were looking for a place to stay. I looked back at the driver. The cap fell away, revealing there was nothing beneath it but a hollow wooden frame. I realized then that the bus wasn't a vehicle, it was a collector. I tried to step off the bus, but my foot hit an invisible wall at the threshold. I looked down at my hands. They were turning translucent, the color of the fog outside. I looked at the digital clock on my phone. The numbers were spinning backward at an impossible speed. The last passenger boarded, a woman who looked remarkably like my mother. She stopped, looked directly into my eyes, and whispered, "Move over, you're in my seat." The doors hissed shut. The engine roared back to life with the sound of 1,000 screaming voices. As we headed into the fog, I looked at the window one last time. I no longer had a reflection.
The silence of a rural house at 2 a.m. isn't actually silent. It's a dense, pressurized layer of sound. The rhythmic hum of the refrigerator 2 rooms away, the settling of floorboards against the frost outside, and the frantic internal thrum of one's own pulse. I've lived in this house for 3 years, and I've learned to translate its vocabulary. A sharp crack is the radiator. A low groan is the wind in the eaves. But the sound that woke me tonight had no translation. It was a dry, sliding noise. It sounded like a heavy winter coat being dragged slowly across a hardwood floor. Sss, clack. Sss, clack. I lay paralyzed in the dark, my eyes fixed on the sliver of gray light beneath my bedroom door. I live alone. My nearest neighbor is a half-mile stretch of dormant cornfields away. Logic, that fragile shield we use to protect ourselves from the dark, whispered that it was probably a draft moving a stray piece of mail, but the rhythm was wrong. It was deliberate. The first movement. I reached out, my hand trembling, and grabbed my phone from the nightstand. The sudden glare of the screen felt like a physical blow. 2:14 a.m. No notifications, no messages, just the cold digital glow illuminating the outlines of my furniture. Scritch. It was closer now. It wasn't in the hallway anymore. It was directly on the other side of the wood. It sounded like a fingernail or something harder, like a dry bone, running gently down the length of the door frame. My breath hitched. I didn't dare exhale. I felt that primal lizard brain realization that I was being hunted, or at the very least, observed. I sat up slowly. The springs of the mattress let out a tiny, high-pitched squeak. The scratching stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a predatory silence, the kind that feels like it's leaning in to listen to your heartbeat. I stared at the door handle. It was an old brass lever, the kind that rattles if you so much as sneeze near it. I watched it with an intensity that made my vision blur. "Please don't turn," I prayed. "Please don't move." The shadow in the gap. The gap between the bottom of the door and the floor was barely an inch wide. In the dim light from the hallway window, I saw it, a shadow. It wasn't a solid block of darkness like a pair of feet. It was fluid, like ink spilled into water. It drifted across the sliver of light, blocking it out entirely, then retreated. Then it did it again. Something was pacing. It wasn't walking with the heavy footfalls of a man. It was shifting its weight with an eerie, weightless grace. Then came the whisper. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't even a human sound. It was a dry, wheezing aspiration, like air escaping a punctured lung. It sounded like my name, but the vowels were elongated, twisted into something that didn't fit a human throat. Eli. My skin turned to ice. I fumbled for the lamp, but my fingers were numb with terror. I knocked a glass of water off the nightstand. It hit the carpet with a dull thud, the water soaking into the rug. The scratching stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a predatory silence, the kind that feels like it's leaning in to listen to your heartbeat. I stared at the door handle. It was an old brass lever, the kind that rattles if you so much as sneeze near it. I watched it with an intensity that made my vision blur. "Please don't turn," I prayed. "Please don't move." The failed escape. Panic finally broke through my paralysis. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my thumbs slipping on the glass. "911, what is your emergency?" The operator's voice was tinny and distant. "I live alone. Someone is in my house. They're outside my bedroom door. Please, 4421 Mill Road." "Sir, stay on the line. I'm dispatching officers. Is your door locked?" I looked at the brass lever. I couldn't remember. I never locked the interior doors. I'm the only one here. I don't think so. "Can you get to a window?" My bedroom is on the second floor. Below the window is a sheer drop onto a concrete patio. "No, I'm trapped. It's right there. It's leaning on the door." Suddenly, the pressure on the door vanished. I heard the sliding sound again, moving away. Clack, clack. It headed towards the stairs. "It's leaving," I told the operator. A surge of adrenaline made me lightheaded. "I think it's going downstairs." "Stay where you are, Eli. Don't leave the room." I waited. My ears were ringing. I heard the distant sound of a heavy door opening. The back door? Had I left it unlocked? Then silence. A long, agonizing minute passed. 2 minutes. 3 minutes. The twist.
The sirens finally broke the stillness of the night. Red and blue lights began to pulse against my curtains, casting long, strobing shadows across the walls. I felt a wave of relief so powerful I nearly collapsed. "The police are there, Eli," the operator said. "They're entering the house now. Stay on the line until they reach you." I heard the front door being kicked in, the muffled shouts of police, and the heavy thud of boots on the stairs. I stood up, wiping the cold sweat from my forehead. I walked towards the door, ready to throw it open and embrace the safety of the law. "Eli," called a voice from the hallway. It was a deep, authoritative officer's voice. "We're outside. Step back from the door. We're coming in." I reached for the handle, my hand inches away. "Wait!" The operator's voice came sharply through my phone. I paused. "What? They're right here. They're at the door." "Eli, listen to me very carefully," the operator said, her voice suddenly tight with a new kind of fear. "The officers just radioed in. They haven't made it to the second floor yet. They're still clearing the basement. They said the stairs have been blocked from the other side." I froze. My hand was still hovering over the brass lever. The voice on the other side of my door, the deep, authoritative officer's voice, spoke again, but this time the mask slipped. The tone was too perfect, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Eli," the voice said from inches away, "open the door. We're the police." Then, from the bottom of the door, I saw the shadow return. But it wasn't a shadow. It was a thin, pale, multi-jointed finger sliding through the gap between the door and the floor. It began to hook upward, feeling for the latch on the inside. And from the hallway, I heard the sound of a dozen different voices, all whispering my name at once.
The silence of a house at night isn't actually silent. It's a rhythmic, heavy thing. The hum of the refrigerator, the groan of floorboards settling, the wet thud of rain against the glass. I was lost in that silence, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep that felt like a distant country I wasn't allowed to visit. Then the vibrations started. My phone skittered across the nightstand, its screen cutting through the dark like a blade of artificial white light. I squinted. No caller ID. I checked the time. 3:07 a.m. I hesitated. Nobody calls at 3 in the morning with good news. But the persistence of the buzz felt heavy, almost demanding. I swiped the screen and pressed the cold glass to my ear. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice sounding thin. For a long moment, there was only the sound of static, a dry, shifting noise, like dead leaves blowing across pavement. Then, a voice. It wasn't a scream or a growl. It was a soft, melodic rasp. "The blue sweater looks better on the chair than it did on you, Elias." A chill, sharper than the draft from the window, spiked down my spine. I looked toward the corner of the room. My blue sweater was draped over the wooden armchair. I hadn't turned the light on. The room was pitch black. "Who is this?" I demanded, sitting up. My heart began to drum a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Don't look at the door," the whispered said, ignoring my question. "Look at the window. You forgot to lock the latch on the left side. You always forget the left one, just like you forgot to check the back seat of your car after work today." My breath hitched. I looked at the window. The latch was up. I could see the sliver of silver metal reflecting the moonlight. My hand shook as I gripped the phone. This wasn't just a prank. This was someone who had been following me, someone who was watching me right now. "I'm calling the police," I hissed, though I didn't move.
I felt paralyzed, pinned to the mattress by the weight of the voice. "The police won't arrive until 3:22 a.m., the caller said calmly. "By then, the air in that room will be very, very still. Do you want to know why you're really awake, Elias? It's not the insomnia, it's the smell. Can you smell it yet?" I froze. I inhaled deeply, and then I caught it. A faint, cloying scent, copper and wet earth, like a butcher shop after a rainstorm. It was coming from the hallway. "I'm not in the house, Elias," the voice said, sensing my terror. It sounded almost amused now. "That would be too simple. I'm much closer than that." "Where are you?" I choked out, tears of pure adrenaline stinging my eyes. "Think back to the accident 2 years ago, the rainy night on Route 9. You felt the bump. You saw the scarf in the rearview mirror, but you didn't stop. You kept driving because you were scared. You told yourself it was a deer." My blood turned to ice. No one knew about that. No one. "I've been under the asphalt since then," the voice continued, the static growing louder, sounding more like wet, bubbling gasps. "Do you hear that tapping? That's not the rain. Tap, tap, tap." The sound didn't come from the window. It came from inside the wall, right behind my headbed. "I'm not in the room, Elias. I'm in the foundation. I've been moving through the pipes, through the insulation, following the heat of your heart. I'm so cold, I just want a bit of your warmth." The floorboards in the center of the room began to creak, not downward, but upward, as if something was pushing from beneath the wood. The static on the phone reached a deafening roar. "Stop it!" I screamed, throwing the phone across the room. It bounced off the rug, the speaker still active. In the dim light, I saw the phone screen flip over. The no caller ID name had changed. It now showed my own name, Elias. From the floor, the voice on the phone gave one final wet chuckle. "Look down, Elias. You aren't holding the phone anymore, but you can still hear me, can't you?" I looked at my hands. They were covered in wet earth and gray, decaying skin. I felt a sudden agonizing coldness in my chest, not the cold of fear, but the cold of a body that hasn't breathed in years. I looked toward the bed. I saw myself, the living version of me, screaming, clutching a phone that wasn't there, staring in horror at the spot where I stood. The twist wasn't that he was in the house. The twist was that I was the one trying to get back in. The streetlights flickered as I pulled into my driveway. There, standing by the curb, was Mr. Henderson. He was wearing his usual beige cardigan, meticulously clipping the hedges of his front garden. I rolled down my window to wave, but the greeting died in my throat. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Mr. Henderson didn't wave back. He didn't even look up. He just kept clipping, the metallic snip, snip, snip echoing in the silent street. The terrifying part wasn't that he was there. The terrifying part was that I had been a pallbearer at his funeral exactly 14 months ago. As I watched, he slowly turned his head. Behind his spectacles, there were no eyes, only the same damp gray earth I had helped shovel over his casket.